There's simply no clearer way to put it than this. We're about to go over one of the greatest games of chess ever played. Bobby Fischer against the great Grandmaster Paul Benko. This is at the 1959 candidates, which is somewhat ironic because Benko stepped aside at the interzonal to clear the way for Fischer to play in the World Championship in 1972. Here they're competing in the candidate cycle in 1959, and the variations are just mind-bogglingly beautiful and brilliant. We're going to go a little bit deeper dive than we do normally in Chess Dog videos, but you are really going to enjoy watching this masterpiece unfold before your eyes. Fischer has white, Benko has black. Let's jump right in. Fischer begins with e4, best by test, as he put it. c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3. And here, of course, black can play e5 or the Sveshnikov, but here Benko plays d6. This is called the classical Sicilian. Basically, in this line, black puts a little more emphasis on piece development as compared to, say, a knight or for dragon. So it's a little bit safer for black, but Benko is not very safe in this game. Bishop c4, Fischer's favorite move, the Sozin variation, placing the bishop in a very aggressive position. Queen to b6, hitting the knight at d4 twice, so the knight goes back to e2. He doesn't want to block this f-pawn. He wants to use the f-pawn to attack later. e6, creating the little center and blunting a little bit this bishop at c4. Castles, bishop to e7, bishop to b3, just completing the development. Castles, and now king to h1. The basic idea is he wants to play f4, but the pawn is pinned by the queen at b6 right now, so he just moves his king out of the way to prepare for the attack. So Benko plays knight to a5, hitting that bishop on b3, threatening to exchange it off, and later the knight could go to c4 if it were supported by a rook or a queen. Fischer plays bishop to g5. Basically, he wants to get the bishop developed before he plays f4 so the f-pawn doesn't block it in. Queen to c5. Benko is attacking the undefended bishop at g5, but he is also preparing the move b5 himself to kick this c3 knight away, which is, at the moment, the sole defender of the pawn on e4. Fischer just goes ahead with f4, b5, continuing his plan, so to kick the knight away and leave the e-pawn undefended. So Fischer plays knight to g3. Well, of course, he's defending e4 a second time, and also moving his knight to the king side, but he has a much more powerful idea in mind here. His idea is to play e5 and then use the e4 square as a pivot point for his knights so that they can get involved directly with the attack on black's king. Computers today say bishop b7, attacking the pawn again and helping to control e4 is black's best move. But Benko continues with his plan, b4, attacking the knight on c3. And here, Fischer plays an immensely powerful move. And this is a computer's top choice today. Very hard to see. And that's the move e5. He ignores the fact that his own knight at c3 is being attacked. He counterattacks black's knight on f6 and clears the e4 square for his knights. Now let's take a look at some options here. Benko in the game plays de5, but what if instead he just takes the bishop at b3? Fischer takes on f6. And here, if a bishop takes f6, knight c to e4, we see this idea repeat itself a lot. He's attacking the queen and the bishop at f6, threatening to wreck the pawn structure. If queen d4, bishop takes f6, you would need to take the queens off just to save, because the attack after the queen enters on g4 would be too much. But after rook a d1, knight c5, bishop e7, that's it. He's up a minor piece and he's attacking the pawn and the rook. That will be all she wrote. So instead, what if black takes with the g-pawn? Well, in that case, bishop to h6, attacking the rook at f8 and threatening queen to g4 check, which would threaten mate on g7, would be very strong. So knight b3 is not a great idea. Well, what if instead he just takes the knight? You know, he was threatening to take it, so just go ahead and take it. Well, in that case, Fischer takes on f6. And here, if gf6, again, bishop h6, threatening queen to g4 with the possibility of mate on g7. And what if he says, well, you can have the rook, but I just want to keep your queen out of the g4 square? Well, he's still not safe, because now knight to h5. The knight enters the attack, and the queen is threatening queen d3, queen g3, and white has a very strong position. So instead, he would take with the bishop, let's say, bishop f6, gf6, And again, this idea of knight to e4 hitting the queen and the pawn at f6. So queen to f5 defends the f6 square, but then knight takes d6 hits the queen, queen to g6, rook to f3, obviously threatening rook to g3, which would pin the queen to the king. So the king moves out of the way, rook to g3, queen to h6, and now queen to g4 with a very nasty threat. The threat is queen to g8 check. And after rook takes, knight to f7 is checkmate. Yes, because the king can't move because the rook controls g7. So black would need to play queen to g6, and then Fischer would just play queen to h4, and the queen is completely trapped. There's nowhere the queen can go. So that variation would have been very effective for Fischer. So instead, after e5, Benko takes on e5. Fischer takes on f6. Now here, if he retakes with the bishop, then knight ce4 attacks the queen and the bishop. He wants to play knight f6 and wreck the pawn structure again, but queen to e7 looks like it's preventing that from happening, but it isn't because of this move, knight to h5. The second knight attacks f6. If he tries to save the bishop, that doesn't work because after pawn takes, the queen is coming into g4, and white has far too many attacking pieces. He would need to play king to h8, but then you just take. Then pawn takes, allowing the rook to enter into the attack so the knight can come to f6. After fe5, knight to f6. And the simple threat of queen to h5, queen to h7 mate would force black to give up too much material, and Fischer would win in that case. Also, if he goes ahead and takes the knight on this move, then again, knight to e4. If queen to b4, then queen to g4, threatening mate on g7. Bishop f6, knight to f6, check. It's the king. Obviously, the knight can't be taken because of the pin on the g-pawn. Then queen to h4, threatening mate on h7. And here, if pawn takes knight, then queen f6, king g8, rook f3, with the threat of mate on after rook g3. If pawn takes to control the g3 square, then you just take. You're hitting the queen and threatening rook to g4. You have to give up the queen. And that would be too much. Actually, after h6, knight g4, Fischer is threatening a sacrifice on h6, but in fact, this is the one line that if Benko had seen it, who could see this? You have to be a correspondence player to see this, where black is actually preserving some form of equality in this position. That was like the one opportunity he had, but he's in big trouble. Instead, here he takes with the g-pawn, takes on f6, but then our thematic idea that we saw that Fischer created with e5, hitting the queen, putting pressure on f6. Here, if the queen goes to c7, then knight to h5. The other knight would put pressure on f6, and if f5, knight hf6 check, king g7, queen to h5, threatening mate on h7. If bishop f6, the other knight can just take, because black cannot take that knight because queen to g5 would be mate in this variation. So he would have to play h6, but then after rook to f3, the rook is coming in. Rook to h8. If he plays king takes f6 check, then queen to h4, king g7, rook g3, king h7. Now rook to h3. And the threat of queen takes h6 is decisive. So rook to h8 tries to defend, but then knight to e8 check. Crazy. Forking the king and the queen, but isn't the knight just hanging? It is, but look at these variations. Simply astonishing. Rook takes e8, rook to g3 check. The king moves to f8, queen to h6 check, king to e7, queen to h4 check. So here, if the king moves to f8, then rook to h3, and the threat is to just play queen to f6, and rook to h8 mate would be unstoppable. So queen to d8 keeps the queen out of f6. The problem is after queen h6, king e7, queen to g5, the queen is now no longer in the way of the rook, so he can't go back to f8 because that would just be mate. King to d7, then rook to d3 check, and the queen is behind the king, and that would be that. So if instead queen to h4 check, king to d6, he just moves the king away. Then rook to d3 check, king c6, bishop to a4 check. Skewers the king to the rook. After king to b7, bishop takes e8. And again, decisive material and these head-spinning complications. So Benko, again, a very strong player, plays this idea, queen to d4. Really a strong idea. And the concept is this. Obviously, he offers the exchange of queens. He wants that queen off the board. Now, Fischer's not going to allow that. He knows Fischer's not going to allow that. But what he wants to do is at some point take on f4, play f5, and allow the queen to defend g7 along that diagonal. So Fischer has to keep that queen from entering into the defense of black's king. First, he plays queen to h5, putting the queen in prime attacking position. Now here, if king to h8, queen to h6, if ef4, knight to h5, threatening mate on g7, if rook to g8, knight ef6, bishop takes, knight takes, threatening mate on h7, and rook g7, rook f to d1. Hits the queen and threatens a devastating check on d8. Queen b6, knight to h5, again threatening mate. If rook to g6, queen to f8, the rook comes back. Then queen to f7, still threatening knight f6, h6, knight f6, and that would be all she wrote. And in this position, the threat, of course, is knight f6, bishop takes f6, queen to f8, mate. So he's got to deal with that. Rook to g8 is the other option. Then knight to f6, threatening mate on g7. Rook g7, the knight comes in, again threatening mate now on g7. Bishop f6, queen to f6, and the rook is pinned. If black plays ef4, then knight to f5. I mean, look at this. I mean, this is crazy. Sacrificing the knight and inviting quadrupled isolated pawns. The idea is to get the rook into the game. And after rook f4, the threat of rook h4, queen h7 is impossible really to stop without giving away serious material. Queen takes knight just to stop that. Rook takes, pawn takes, but then queen takes a5. That knight hanging out at a5 was undefended. And if instead in this position king to g7, then rook a to d1, queen to b2. Again, it's not that he wants the pawn, he just wants to keep the queen on this diagonal for defensive purposes. Queen to h4, with the threat of knight to h5 collapsing on the f6 square. Bishop b7, knight takes f6, bishop takes, and now knight to h5, check. It's the king and the bishop. If king g8, knight to f6, check, king g7, and then you get a quick mate. You know, I'm as impressed as I am with Fischer's attacking play, I'm kind of impressed with Benko sidestepping all of these variations. Normal human beings would get mated much earlier. Knight takes b3, queen to h6. He doesn't worry about the rook hanging at a1. He just wants to play knight to h5, queen to g7 mate. Here, if Benko had played f5, then c3. The idea is, again, to kick the queen off of this diagonal. After bc3, bc3, queen to c4, now knight to h5, and there's just no way to defend against mate on g7. So instead, Benko plays ef4. Now he's threatening f5, so the queen can come back to defend on g7. But knight to h5, still very powerful. After f5, rook a to d1 hits the queen. The queen plays to e7, trying to stay on that diagonal, but now knight ef6 check, bishop takes, knight takes, and of course if the king moves to h8, it's just queen h7 mate. So Benko has to give up his queen, which he does. Now in this position, believe it or not, after all of that, Benko has 2 minor pieces and 2 pawns for the queen. If the normal point count system, that would be 8 points versus 9 points. Pretty good, considering all the pressure he has been under. But he's got this knight on b3, currently under attack, so he has to save it. Knight to c5. Now, how does Fischer finish this game? How do you create a double attack in this position? There's that old saying, loose pieces drop off, right? And this knight at c5 is a loose piece. It's just sitting there undefended. How does Fischer exploit that? Can you see it? It's simple once you see it executed. He plays queen to g5 check. The king has to move to h8, and now this rook is unprotected. Queen to e7. There's your double attack, attacking the knight and attacking the rook. Bishop to a6 attacks the rook at f1, but then queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes. And here in this position, finally, with a decisive material advantage and a safer king, Paul Benko resigned one of, if not the greatest, Kingside attacking games ever played. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.